It belonged to Domain, the oil man. He turned me around again, politely and abruptly. He was saying some last word to her, but the eagerness in his manner tightened abruptly into formality as several people approached him to say goodbye. You always have a green light that burns all night at the end of your dock. Daisy put her arm through his abruptly, but he seemed absorbed in what he had just said. She must have seen something of this in my expression, for she turned abruptly away and ran up the porch steps into the house. The shadow of a tree fell abruptly across the dew, and ghostly birds began to sing among the blue leaves. Darius, we talked like that for a while, and then abruptly we weren't talking any longer. I suppose she talks, and eats, and everything. Oh, yes. She looked at me absently. I thought you might be here, she responded absently as I came up. Does it? He turned his eyes toward it absently. The other girl, Daisy, made an attempt to rise. She leaned slightly forward with a conscientious expression, then she laughed, an absurd, charming little laugh, and I laughed too and came forward into the room. They're nice to have, a dog. We backed up to a gray old man who bore an absurd resemblance to John D. Rockefeller. Precisely at that point it vanished, and I was looking at an elegant young roughneck, a year or two over 30, whose elaborate formality of speech just missed being absurd. All I kept thinking about, over and over, was, you can't live forever, you can't live forever. She turned to Mrs. McKee, and the room rang full of her artificial laughter. Then from the living room I heard a sort of choking murmur and part of a laugh, followed by Daisy's voice on a clear, artificial note. For Daisy was young and her artificial world was redolent of orchids and pleasant, cheerful snobbery and orchestras which set the rhythm of the year, summing up the sadness and suggestiveness of life in new tunes. This is a valley of ashes, a fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills, and grotesque gardens where ashes take the forms of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and finally, with a transcendent effort, of men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. The Valley of Ashes is bounded on one side by a small foul river, and when the drawbridge is up to let barges through, the passengers on waiting trains can stare at the dismal scene for as long as half an hour. One of the 3 shops it contained was for rent, and another was an all-night restaurant approached by a trail of ashes. The third was a garage, repairs. Then the Valley of Ashes opened out on both sides of us, and I had a glimpse of Mrs. Wilson straining at the garage pump with panting vitality as we went by. They got into automobiles which bore them out to Long Island, and somehow they ended up at Gatsby's door. I was sure that they were selling something, bonds or insurance or automobiles. Only gradually did I become aware that the automobiles which turned expectantly into his drive stayed for just a minute and then drove sulkily away. We saw the 3 or 4 automobiles and the crowd when we were still some distance away. It was gas blue with lavender beads. The prolonged and tumultuous argument that ended by herding us into that room eludes me, though I have a sharp physical memory that, in the course of it, my underwear kept climbing like a damp snake around my legs and intermittent beads of sweat raced cool across my back. Through this twilight universe Daisy began to move again with the season. Suddenly she was again keeping half a dozen dates a day with half a dozen men and drowsing asleep at dawn with the beads and chiffon of an evening dress tangled among dying orchids on the floor beside her bed. I lived at West Egg, the less fashionable of the two, though this is a most superficial tag to express the bizarre and not a little sinister contrast between them. 50 feet from the door a dozen headlights illuminated a bizarre and tumultuous scene. I don't want you to get a wrong idea of me from all these stories you hear. So he was aware of the bizarre accusations that flavored conversation in his halls. The only picture was an over-enlarged photograph, apparently a hen sitting on a blurred rock. Her eyebrows had been plucked and then drawn on again at a more rakish angle, but the efforts of nature toward the restoration of the old alignment gave a blurred air to her face. But it was all going by too fast now for his blurred eyes, and he knew that he had lost that part of it, the freshest and the best, forever. A breeze blew through the room, blew curtains in at one end and out the other like pale flags, twisting them up toward the frosted wedding cake of the ceiling, and then rippled over the wine-colored rug, making a shadow on it as wind does on the sea. Well, he certainly must have strained himself to get this menagerie together. A breeze stirred the gray haze of Daisy's fur collar. Daisy and Jordan lay upon an enormous couch, like silver idols, weighing down their own white dresses against the singing breeze of the fans. At least once a fortnight, a corps of caterers came down with several hundred feet of canvas and enough colored lights to make a Christmas tree of Gatsby's enormous garden. Suddenly one of these gypsies in trembling opal seizes a cocktail out of the air, dumps it down for courage, and moving her hands like Frisco dances out alone on the canvas platform. There was dancing now on the canvas in the garden, old men pushing young girls backward in eternal graceless circles, superior couples holding each other tortuously, fashionably, and keeping in the corners, and a great number of single girls dancing individualistically or relieving the orchestra for a moment of the burden of the banjo or the traps. It was James Gatz who had been loafing along the beach that afternoon in a torn green jersey and a pair of canvas pants, but it was already J. Gatsby who borrowed a rowboat, pulled out to the Tuolumne, and informed Cody that a wind might catch him and break him up in half an hour. The rain poured down his thick glasses, and he took them off and wiped them to see the protecting canvas unrolled from Gatsby's grave. In his blue gardens men and girls came and went like moths among the whisperings and the champagne and the stars. A pair of stage twins, who turned out to be the girls in yellow, did a baby act in costume, and champagne was served in glasses bigger than finger bowls. I had taken 2 finger bowls of champagne, and the scene had changed before my eyes into something significant, elemental, and profound. She had drunk a quantity of champagne, and during the course of her song she had decided ineptly that everything was very, very sad. She was not only singing, she was weeping too. Sometimes in the course of gay parties women used to rub champagne into his hair. For himself, he formed the habit of letting liquor alone. A little champagne? There were the same people, or at least the same sort of people, the same profusion of champagne, the same many-colored, many-keyed commotion, but I felt an unpleasantness in the air, a pervading harshness that hadn't been there before. She was extended full length at her end of the divan, completely motionless and with her chin raised a little as if she were balancing something on it which was quite likely to fall. Then he sat down, rigidly, his elbow on the arm of the sofa and his chin in his hand. "That drugstore business was just small change," continued Tom slowly, "but you've got something on now that Walter's afraid to tell me about." I glanced at Daisy, who was staring terrified between Gatsby and her husband, and at Jordan, who had begun to balance an invisible but absorbing object on the tip of her chin. She was dressed to play golf, and I remember thinking she looked like a good illustration, her chin raised a little, jauntily, her hair the color of an autumn leaf, her face the same brown tint as the fingerless glove on her knee. "What Gatsby?" Before I could reply that he was my neighbor, dinner was announced. Wedging his tense arm imperatively under mine, Tom Buchanan compelled me from the room as though he were moving a checker to another square. Things went from bad to worse until finally he had to give up his position. For a moment the last sunshine fell with romantic affection upon her glowing face, her voice compelled me forward breathlessly as I listened, then the glow faded, each light deserting her with lingering regret like children leaving a pleasant street at dusk. Its vanished trees, the trees that had made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory enchanted moment man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. She was only extemporizing, but a stirring warmth flowed from her as if her heart was trying to come out to you concealed in one of those breathless, thrilling words. It had occurred to me that this shadow of a garage must be a blind and that sumptuous and romantic apartments were concealed overhead when the proprietor himself appeared in the door of an office, wiping his hands on a piece of waste. The bored haughty face that she turned to the world concealed something. Most affectations conceal something eventually, even though they don't in the beginning, and one day I found what it was. And inside, as we wandered through Marie Antoinette music rooms and restoration salons, I felt that there were guests concealed behind every couch and table, under orders to be breathlessly silent until we had passed through. Time for this good girl to go to bed. Jordan's going to play in the tournament tomorrow, explained Daisy, over at Westchester. Oh, you're Jordan Baker. I knew now why her face was familiar. Its pleasing contemptuous expression had looked out at me from many rotogravure pictures of the sporting life at Asheville and Hot Springs and Palm Beach. I was on my way to get roaring drunk from sheer embarrassment when Jordan Baker came out of the house and stood at the head of the marble steps, leaning a little backward and looking with contemptuous interest down into the garden. He knew women early, and since they spoiled him he became contemptuous of them, of young virgins, because they were ignorant, of the others, because they were hysterical about things which in his overwhelming self-absorption he took for granted. Mrs. Wilson had changed her costume some time before and was now attired in an elaborate afternoon dress of cream-colored chiffon, which gave out a continual rustle as she swept about the room. A pair of stage twins, who turned out to be the girls in yellow, did a baby act in costume, and champagne was served in glasses bigger than finger bowls. A large photograph of an elderly man in yachting costume attracted me, hung on the wall over his desk. He used to be my best friend years ago. There was a small picture of Gatsby, also in yachting costume, on the bureau, Gatsby with his head thrown back defiantly, taken apparently when he was about 18. The only completely stationary object in the room was an enormous couch on which two young women were buoyed up as though upon an anchored balloon. Tom and Miss Baker sat at either end of the long couch, and she read aloud to him from the Saturday Evening Post, the words, murmurous and uninflected, running together in a soothing tune. One of them I call Montauk Point, the gulls, and the other I call Montauk Point, the sea. The sister Catherine sat down beside me on the couch. When he had gone halfway he turned around and stared at the scene, his wife and Catherine scolding and consoling as they stumbled here and there among the crowded furniture with articles of aid, and the despairing figure on the couch bleating fluently and trying to spread a copy of Town Tattle over the tapestry scenes of Versailles. They were sitting at either end of the couch looking at each other as if some question had been asked or was in the air, and every vestige of embarrassment was gone. And inside, as we wandered through Marie Antoinette music rooms and restoration salons, I felt that there were guests, concealed behind every couch and table, under orders to be breathlessly silent until we had passed through. He lit Daisy's cigarette from a trembling match, and sat down with her on a couch far across the room where there was no light save what the gleaming floor bounced in from the hall. Daisy and Jordan lay upon an enormous couch, like silver idols, weighing down their own white dresses against the singing breeze of the fans. Then she remembered the heat and sat down guiltily on the couch just as a freshly laundered nurse, leading a little girl, came into the room. "She's got my hair and shape of the face." Daisy sat back upon the couch. Until long after midnight a changing crowd lapped up against the front of the garage while George Wilson rocked himself back and forth on the couch inside. "Never heard of them," he remarked decisively. "He's singing away," her voice sang. "It's romantic, isn't it, Tom?" "Very romantic," he said, and then miserably to me, "If it's light enough after dinner I want to take you down to the stables." The telephone rang inside, startlingly, and as Daisy shook her head decisively at Tom, the subject of the stables, in fact all subjects, vanished into air. "That dog's a boy." "It's a bitch," said Tom decisively. "I know nothing whatever about mechanics," he said decisively. "One time he killed a man who had found out that he was nephew to von Hindenburg and second cousin to the devil." "I wonder where in the devil he met Daisy." "How the devil did it happen?" "Well, I tried to swing the wheel," he broke off, and suddenly I guessed at the truth. The interior was unprosperous and bare. The only car visible was the dust-covered wreck of a Ford which crouched in a dim corner. I have been drunk just twice in my life, and the second time was that afternoon, so everything that happened has a dim hazy cast over it, although until after 8 o'clock the apartment was full of cheerful sun. He informed me that he was in the artistic game, and I gathered later that he was a photographer and had made the dim enlargement of Mrs. Wilson's mother, which hovered like an ectoplasm on the wall. Well, he told me once he was an Oxford man. A dim background started to take shape behind him, but at her next remark it faded away. What would happen now in the dim incalculable hours? It was a yellow car. Some dim impulse moved the policeman to look suspiciously at Tom. Those who went farther than Chicago would gather in the old dim Union Station at 6 o'clock of a December evening with a few Chicago friends already caught up into their own holiday gaieties to bid them a hasty goodbye. When we pulled out into the winter night and the real snow, our snow, began to stretch out beside us and twinkle against the windows, and the dim lights of small Wisconsin stations moved by, a sharp wild brace came suddenly into the air. Involuntarily I glanced seaward, and distinguished nothing except a single green light, minute and far away, that might have been the end of a dock. Now it was again a green light on a dock. And as I sat there brooding on the old, unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. The lamplight, bright on his boots and dull on the autumn leaf yellow of her hair, glinted along the paper as she turned a page with a flutter of slender muscles in her arms. His bedroom was the simplest room of all, except where the dresser was garnished with a toilet set of pure dull gold. Did you ever have any children? The hard brown beetles kept thudding against the dull light, and whenever Michaelis heard a car go tearing along the road outside, it sounded to him like the car that hadn't stopped a few hours before. I went up to New York with Tom on the train one afternoon, and when we stopped by the ash heaps he jumped to his feet and, taking hold of my elbow, literally forced me from the car. "She had a fight with a man who says he's her husband," explained a girl at my elbow. Then he sat down, rigidly, his elbow on the arm of the sofa and his chin in his hand. With fenders spread like wings we scattered light through half Astoria, only half, for as we twisted among the pillars of the elevated I heard the familiar jug, spat, of a motorcycle, and a frantic policeman rode alongside. Instinct made him step on the accelerator with the double purpose of overtaking Daisy and leaving Wilson behind, and we sped along toward Astoria at 50 miles an hour, until, among the spidery girders of the elevated, we came in sight of the easygoing blue coupe. Tom talked incessantly, exulting and laughing, but his voice was as remote from Jordan and me as the foreign clamor on the sidewalk or the tumult of the elevated overhead. "I'm going to have the McKees come up," she announced as we rose in the elevator. A reluctant elevator boy went for a box full of straw and some milk, to which he added on his own initiative a tin of large hard dog biscuits, one of which decomposed apathetically in the saucer of milk all afternoon. "Come to lunch some day," he suggested, as we groaned down in the elevator. "Where?" "Anywhere." "Keep your hands off the lever," snapped the elevator boy. The door that I pushed open on the advice of an elevator boy was marked the Swastika Holding Company, and at first there didn't seem to be anyone inside. "When they do get married," continued Catherine, "they're going west to live for a while until it blows over. It'd be more discreet to go to Europe." "Oh, do you like Europe?" she exclaimed, surprisingly. "What?" I exclaimed. "I beg your pardon, but Mr. Gatsby would like to speak to you alone." "With me?" she exclaimed in surprise. Gatsby answered for me. "Oh, no," he exclaimed, "this isn't the man." "No?" Mr. Wolfsheim seemed disappointed. "Well, that's funny," I exclaimed. "I adore it," exclaimed Daisy. "I've never met so many celebrities," Daisy exclaimed. "My wife and I want to go west." "Your wife does," exclaimed Tom, startled. "She loves me." "You must be crazy," exclaimed Tom automatically. Her eyebrows had been plucked and then drawn on again at a more rakish angle, but the efforts of nature toward the restoration of the old alignment gave a blurred air to her face. "Get some more ice and mineral water, Myrtle, before everybody goes to sleep." I told that boy about the ice. Myrtle raised her eyebrows in despair at the shiftlessness of the lower orders. "Yes, madam." She got up slowly, raising her eyebrows at me in astonishment, and followed the butler toward the house. That anyone should care in this heat, whose flushed lips he kissed, whose head made damp the pajama pocket over his heart. It was a cold fall day, with fire in the room and her cheeks flushed. After a little while Mr. Gatz opened the door and came out, his mouth ajar, his face flushed slightly, his eyes leaking isolated and unpunctual tears. The butler came back and murmured something close to Tom's ear, whereupon Tom frowned, pushed back his chair and without a word went inside. Doesn't he know she doesn't want him? She says she does want him. She has a big dinner party and he won't know a soul there. He frowned. As we got out of the car he glanced at me and frowned slightly. Why candles? Objected Daisy, frowning. Daisy looked at Tom frowning, and an indefinable expression, at once definitely unfamiliar and vaguely recognizable, as if I had only heard it described in words, passed over Gatsby's face. Just as I slowed up to avoid overtaking him he stopped and began frowning into the windows of a jewelry store. Whenever there was a pause in the song she filled it with gasping broken sobs, and then took up the lyric again in a quavering soprano. "We'll take a look," he said doubtfully, "just a look." I became aware now of a hollow, wailing sound which issued incessantly from the garage, a sound which as we got out of the coupe and walked toward the door resolved itself into the words, "Oh, my God," uttered over and over in a gasping moan. "I want to get his name." Some words of this conversation must have reached Wilson, swaying in the office door, for suddenly a new theme found voice among his gasping cries. The windows were ajar and gleaming white against the fresh grass outside that seemed to grow a little way into the house. He lit Daisy's cigarette from a trembling match, and sat down with her on a couch far across the room where there was no light save what the gleaming floor bounced in from the hall. She had caught a cold and it made her voice huskier and more charming than ever, and Gatsby was overwhelmingly aware of the youth and mystery that wealth imprisons and preserves, of the freshness of many clothes and of Daisy, gleaming like silver, safe and proud above the hot struggles of the poor. I spent my Saturday nights in New York because those gleaming, dazzling parties of his were with me so vividly that I could still hear the music and the laughter faint and incessant from his garden and the cars going up and down his drive. We passed Port Roosevelt, where there was a glimpse of red-belted ocean-going ships, and sped along a cobbled slum lined with the dark, undeserted saloons of the faded gilt 1900s. Then the Valley of Ashes opened out on both sides of us, and I had a glimpse of Mrs. Wilson straining at the garage pump with panting vitality as we went by. He doesn't know very much about Tom, though he says he's read a Chicago paper for years just on the chance of catching a glimpse of Daisy's name. It was dark now, and as we dipped under a little bridge I put my arm around Jordan's golden shoulder and drew her toward me and asked her to dinner. Snell was there 3 days before he went to the penitentiary, so drunk out on the gravel drive that Mrs. Ulysses Sweat's automobile ran over his right hand. Daisy's voice got us to our feet and out onto the blazing gravel drive. As we walked across the moonlight gravel to the porch, he disposed of the situation in a few brisk phrases. "I'll see if there's any sign of a commotion." I walked back along the border of the lawn, traversed the gravel softly, and tiptoed up the veranda steps. See Chapter 2. About halfway between West Egg and New York the motor road hastily joins the railroad and runs beside it for a quarter of a mile, so as to shrink away from a certain desolate area of land. "What do you expect?" He snatched the book from me and replaced it hastily on its shelf, muttering that if one brick was removed the whole library was liable to collapse. My incredulity was submerged in fascination now. It was like skimming hastily through a dozen magazines. "I can't go through this alone." Someone started to ask me questions, but I broke away and going upstairs looked hastily through the unlocked parts of his desk. He'd never told me definitely that his parents were dead. "I wish you'd tell anybody who'd be interested." "Oh, I will," he broke out hastily. "San Francisco." "I see. My family all died and I came into a good deal of money." His voice was solemn as if the memory of that sudden extinction of a clan still haunted him. The most grotesque and fantastic conceits haunted him in his bed at night. After Gatsby's death, the East was haunted for me like that, distorted beyond my eyes' power of correction. Blinded by the glare of the headlights and confused by the incessant groaning of the horns, the apparition stood swaying for a moment before he perceived the man in the duster. The caterwauling horns had reached a crescendo and I turned away and cut across the lawn toward home. At the gray tea hour there were always rooms that throbbed incessantly with this low sweet fever, while fresh faces drifted here and there like rose petals blown by the sad horns around the floor. What was that word we Well, these books are all scientific," insisted Tom, glancing at her impatiently. "I just meant," his voice faded off and Tom glanced impatiently around the garage. Jordan's party were calling impatiently to her from the porch, but she lingered for a moment to shake hands. "Just as much as you are. Don't talk so loud. You're acting like a little boy," I broke out impatiently. "I don't want to get stalled in this baking heat." Tom threw on both brakes impatiently and we slid to an abrupt dusty stop under Wilson's sign. "I'll be the man smoking 2 cigarettes. "We can't argue about it here," Tom said impatiently as a truck gave out a cursing whistle behind us. "There aren't any more." "Well, we'd better telephone for an axe. The thing to do is to forget about the heat," said Tom impatiently. "Oh, my God." Presently Tom lifted his head with a jerk and after staring around the garage with glazed eyes addressed a mumbled incoherent remark to the policeman. About 3 o'clock, the quality of Wilson's incoherent muttering changed. He grew quieter and began to talk about the yellow car. "On the last night, with my trunk packed and my car sold to the grocer, I went over and looked at that huge incoherent failure of a house once more. It went in the ditch." The fact was infinitely astonishing to him, and I recognized first the unusual quality of wonder and then the man. It was the late patron of Gatsby's library. On the contrary, they were merely casual events in a crowded summer and, until much later, they absorbed me infinitely less than my personal affairs. Perhaps some unbelievable guest would arrive, a person infinitely rare and to be marveled at, some authentically radiant young girl who with one fresh glance at Gatsby, one moment of magical encounter, would blot out those 5 years of unwavering devotion. He would never so much as look at a friend's wife. When the subject of this instinctive trust returned to the table and sat down, Mr. Wolfsheim drank his coffee with a jerk and got to his feet. His eyes would drop slowly from the swinging light to the laden table by the wall and then jerk back to the light again and he gave out incessantly his high horrible call. "Oh, my God." Presently Tom lifted his head with a jerk and after staring around the garage with glazed eyes addressed a mumbled incoherent remark to the policeman. "That dog will cost you $10. The Airedale, undoubtedly there was an Airedale concerned in it somewhere though its feet were startlingly white, changed hands and settled down into Mrs. Wilson's lap, where she fondled the weatherproof coat with rapture. Sitting on Tom's lap Mrs. Wilson called up several people on the telephone. Then there were no cigarettes and I went out to buy some at the drugstore on the corner. Mr. McKee was asleep on a chair with his fists clenched in his lap, like a photograph of a man of action. She used to sit on the sand with his head in her lap by the hour rubbing her fingers over his eyes and looking at him with unfathomable delight. Then she fell over into my lap and I drove on. Jordan's party were calling impatiently to her from the porch, but she lingered for a moment to shake hands. Gatsby asked me to wait until he was free and I lingered in the garden until the inevitable swimming party had run up, chilled and exalted, from the black beach, until the lights were extinguished in the guest rooms overhead. But Jordan lingered for a moment more. The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard. It was a factual imitation of some Hotel de Ville in Normandy, with a tower on one side, spanking new under a thin beard of raw ivy, and a marble swimming pool and more than 40 acres of lawn and garden. I was on my way to get roaring drunk from sheer embarrassment when Jordan Baker came out of the house and stood at the head of the marble steps, leaning a little backward and looking with contemptuous interest down into the garden. "The piece is known," he concluded lustily, "as Vladimir Tolstoy's Jazz History of the World." The nature of Mr. Tolstoy's composition eluded me, because just as it began my eyes fell on Gatsby, standing alone on the marble steps and looking from one group to another with approving eyes. It was strange to reach the marble steps and find no stir of bright dresses in and out the door, and hear no sound but bird voices in the trees. Then I went out of the room and down the marble steps into the rain, leaving them there together. She hinted in a murmur that the surname of the balancing girl was Baker. I've heard it said that Daisy's murmur was only to make people lean toward her, an irrelevant criticism that made it no less charming. A subdued impassioned murmur was audible in the room beyond and Miss Baker leaned forward, unashamed, trying to hear. The murmur trembled on the verge of coherence, sank down, mounted excitedly, and then ceased altogether. "Tell your chauffeur to go far away and spend an hour. Come back in an hour, Ferdy." Then in a grave murmur, "His name is Ferdy. Does the gasoline affect his nose?" "I don't think so," she said innocently. Then from the living room I heard a sort of choking murmur and part of a laugh, followed by Daisy's voice on a clear, artificial note. While the rain continued, it had seemed like the murmur of their voices, rising and swelling a little, now and then, with gusts of emotion. The circle closed up again with a running murmur of expostulation. It was a minute before I could see anything at all. Dimly, I heard someone murmur, "Blessed are the dead that the rain falls on," and then the owl-eyed man said amen to that, in a brave voice. The butler came back and murmured something close to Tom's ear, whereupon Tom frowned, pushed back his chair, and without a word went inside. A phrase began to beat in my ears with a sort of heady excitement: "There are only the pursued, the pursuing, the busy, and the tired." "And Daisy ought to have something in her life," murmured Jordan to me. Mr. Sloane murmured something close to her ear. "You know I love you," she murmured. "We're all white here," murmured Jordan. "I had a dog, at least I had him for a few days until he ran away, and an old Dodge and a Finnish woman who made my bed and cooked breakfast and muttered Finnish wisdom to herself over the electric stove." "Gratulate me," she muttered. "We've met before," muttered Gatsby. "I've got it." Gatsby examined the parted string, muttered in an interested way, and tossed the book on a chair. "MAV, the policeman was saying." "Oh, no, corrected the man. "MAVRO, listen to me," muttered Tom fiercely. "I spoke to her," he muttered, after a long silence. Roaring noon. As my train emerged from the tunnel into sunlight, only the hot whistles of the National Biscuit Company broke the simmering hush at noon. "I'm sorry, madam, but we can't furnish it. It's far too hot to touch this noon." What he really said was, "Yes, yes. I'll see." He set down the receiver and came toward us, glistening slightly, to take our stiff straw hats. Just before noon the phone woke me, and I started up with sweat breaking out on my forehead. It was just noon. He must have been tired and walking slowly, for he didn't reach Gad's Hill until noon. By 7 o'clock, the orchestra has arrived, no thin 5-piece affair, but a whole pitful of oboes and trombones and saxophones and viols and cornets and piccolos and low and high drums. The lights grow brighter as the earth lurches away from the sun, and now the orchestra is playing yellow cocktail music, and the opera of voices pitches a key higher. A momentary hush, the orchestra leader varies his rhythm obligingly for her, and there is a burst of chatter as the erroneous news goes around that she is Gilda Gray's understudy from the Follies. The party has begun. There was dancing now on the canvas in the garden, old men pushing young girls backward in eternal graceless circles, superior couples holding each other tortuously, fashionably, and keeping in the corners, and a great number of single girls dancing individualistically or relieving the orchestra for a moment of the burden of the banjo or the traps. At small parties there isn't any privacy. There was the boom of a bass drum, and the voice of the orchestra leader rang out suddenly above the echolalia of the garden. "The orchestra left half an hour ago." In spite of the wives' agreement that such malevolence was beyond credibility, the dispute ended in a short struggle, and both wives were lifted kicking into the night. They are not perfect ovals, like the egg in the Columbus story. They are both crushed flat at the contact end, but their physical resemblance must be a source of perpetual confusion to the gulls that fly overhead. It had occurred to me that this shadow of a garage must be a blind, and that sumptuous and romantic apartments were concealed overhead when the proprietor himself appeared in the door of an office, wiping his hands on a piece of waste. Gatsby asked me to wait until he was free, and I lingered in the garden until the inevitable swimming party had run up, chilled and exalted, from the black beach, until the lights were extinguished in the guest rooms overhead. Tom talked incessantly, exulting and laughing, but his voice was as remote from Jordan and me as the foreign clamor on the sidewalk or the tumult of the elevated overhead. While his neighbor was trying to persuade him, a violent racket broke out overhead. He reached up on tiptoes and peered over a circle of heads into the garage, which was lit only by a yellow light in a swinging wire basket overhead. I remember the fur coats of the girls returning from Miss This or That's and the chatter of frozen breath and the hands waving overhead as we caught sight of old acquaintances and the matchings of invitations. "Are you going to the Ordways?" He came down with 100 people in 4 private cars and hired a whole floor of the Seelbach Hotel, and the day before the wedding he gave her a string of pearls valued at $350,000. "Here, dearest." She groped around in a wastebasket she had with her on the bed and pulled out the string of pearls. We gave her spirits of ammonia and put ice on her forehead and hooked her back into her dress, and half an hour later, when we walked out of the room, the pearls were around her neck and the incident was over. He had seen me several times and had intended to call on me long before, but a peculiar combination of circumstances had prevented it. Signed J. Gatsby in a majestic hand. Perhaps his presence gave the evening its peculiar quality of oppressiveness. It stands out in my memory from Gatsby's other parties that summer. Over the ash heaps, the giant eyes of Dr. T. J. Eckelberg kept their vigil, but I perceived, after a moment, that other eyes were regarding us with peculiar intensity from less than 20 feet away. And so it happened that on a warm windy evening I drove over to East Egg to see 2 old friends whom I scarcely knew at all. In fact, I was just thinking, I don't know a soul here. Perhaps you know that lady. Gatsby indicated a gorgeous, scarcely human orchid of a woman who sat in state under a white plum tree. There was a ripe mystery about it, a hint of bedrooms upstairs more beautiful and cool than other bedrooms, of gay and radiant activities taking place through its corridors, and of romances that were not musty and laid away already in lavender, but fresh and breathing and redolent of this year's shining motor cars, and of dances whose flowers were scarcely withered. There was a slow pleasant movement in the air, scarcely a wind, promising a cool lovely day. He must have looked up at an unfamiliar sky through frightening leaves, and shivered as he found what a grotesque thing a rose is, and how raw the sunlight was upon the scarcely created grass. With scarcely a word said, 4 of us, the chauffeur, butler, gardener, and I, hurried down to the pool. A small gust of wind that scarcely corrugated the surface was enough to disturb its accidental course with its accidental burden. "I told you we'd talk about that some other time." "I beg your pardon," said Mr. Wolfsheim, "I had a wrong man." A succulent hash arrived, and Mr. Wolfsheim, forgetting the more sentimental atmosphere of the old metropole, began to eat with ferocious delicacy. "He becomes very sentimental sometimes," explained Gatsby. "This is one of his sentimental days." "You may think that's sentimental, but I mean it, to the bitter end." I saw that for some reason of his own he was determined not to come, so I stood up. It was sharply different from the West, where an evening was hurried from phase to phase toward its close in a continually disappointed anticipation or else in sheer nervous dread of the moment itself. I was on my way to get roaring drunk from sheer embarrassment when Jordan Baker came out of the house and stood at the head of the marble steps, leaning a little backward and looking with contemptuous interest down into the garden. He sends over a selection of things at the beginning of each season, spring and fall. He took out a pile of shirts and began throwing them, one by one, before us, shirts of sheer linen and thick silk and fine flannel, which lost their folds as they fell and covered the table in many-colored disarray. I couldn't guess what Daisy and Tom were thinking, but I doubt if even Miss Baker, who seemed to have mastered a certain hearty skepticism, was able utterly to put this 5th guest's shrill, metallic urgency out of mind. "Let me show you." Taking our skepticism for granted, he rushed to the bookcases and returned with volume 1 of the Stoddard lectures. "See," he cried triumphantly. Suddenly I wasn't thinking of Daisy and Gatsby any more, but of this clean, hard, limited person who dealt in universal skepticism and who leaned back jauntily just within the circle of my arm. "She'll give you a letter of introduction, won't you, Myrtle?" "Do what?" she asked, startled. I was startled, naturally, but the really surprising thing was that it hadn't happened before. For a moment a phrase tried to take shape in my mouth and my lips parted like a dumb man's, as though there was more struggling upon them than a wisp of startled air. "My wife and I want to go west." "Your wife does," exclaimed Tom, startled. Then I turned back to Gatsby, and was startled at his expression. Now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30 with a rather hard mouth and a supercilious manner. A reluctant elevator boy went for a box full of straw and some milk, to which he added on his own initiative a tin of large hard dog biscuits, one of which decomposed apathetically in the saucer of milk all afternoon. A brewer had built it early in the period craze, a decade before, and there was a story that he'd agreed to pay 5 years' taxes on all the neighboring cottages if the owners would have their roofs thatched with straw. The straw seats of the car hovered on the edge of combustion. The woman next to me perspired delicately for a while into her white shirtwaist, and then, as her newspaper dampened under her fingers, lapsed despairingly into deep heat with a desolate cry. "I'm sorry, madam, but we can't furnish it. It's far too hot to touch this noon." What he really said was, "Yes, yes. I'll see." He set down the receiver and came toward us, glistening slightly, to take our stiff straw hats. Tom and Miss Baker, with several feet of twilight between them, strolled back into the library, as if to a vigil beside a perfectly tangible body. While trying to look pleasantly interested and a little deaf, I followed Daisy around a chain of connecting verandas to the porch in front. After that, if the night was mellow, I strolled down Madison Avenue, past the old Murray Hill Hotel and over 33rd Street to the Pennsylvania Station. They arrived at twilight, and as we strolled out among the sparkling hundreds, Daisy's voice was playing murmurous tricks in her throat. He had slept through the heat until after 5, when he strolled over to the garage and found George Wilson sick in his office, really sick, pale as his own pale hair and shaking all over. And Tom's the first sweetie she ever had. The bottle of whiskey, a second one, was now in constant demand by all present, excepting Catherine, who felt just as good on nothing at all. Tom rang for the janitor and sent him for some celebrated sandwiches, which were a complete supper in themselves. "You don't know who we are," said one of the girls in yellow, "but we met you here about a month ago." "You've dyed your hair since then," remarked Jordan, and I started, but the girls had moved casually on and her remark was addressed to the premature moon, produced like the supper, no doubt, out of a caterer's basket. Why don't you stay for supper? I wouldn't be surprised if some other people dropped in from New York." "You come to supper with me," said the lady enthusiastically. Then they sauntered over to my house and sat on the steps for half an hour while at her request I remained watchfully in the garden. "In case there's a fire or a flood," she explained, "or any act of God." Tom appeared from his oblivion as we were sitting down to supper together. The friends looked out at us with the tragic eyes and shored upper lips of southeastern Europe, and I was glad that the sight of Gatsby's splendid car was included in their somber holiday. "You sit here and discuss your sports and your young ladies and your," he supplied an imaginary noun with another wave of his hand. "As for me, I am 50 years old, and I won't impose myself on you any longer." As he shook hands and turned away, his tragic nose was trembling. Human sympathy has its limits, and we were content to let all their tragic arguments fade with the city lights behind. I suppose there'd be a curious crowd around there all day, with little boys searching for dark spots in the dust and some garrulous man telling over and over what had happened until it became less and less real even to him and he could tell it no longer, and Myrtle Wilson's tragic achievement was forgotten. But I didn't call to him, for he gave a sudden intimation that he was content to be alone. He stretched out his arms toward the dark water in a curious way, and far as I was from him I could have sworn he was trembling. Suddenly one of these gypsies in trembling opal seizes a cocktail out of the air, dumps it down for courage, and moving her hands like Frisco dances out alone on the canvas platform. The moon had risen higher, and floating in the sound was a triangle of silver scales, trembling a little to the stiff, tinny drip of the banjos on the lawn. "You sit here and discuss your sports and your young ladies and your," he supplied an imaginary noun with another wave of his hand. "As for me, I am 50 years old, and I won't impose myself on you any longer." As he shook hands and turned away, his tragic nose was trembling. Luckily, the clock took this moment to tilt dangerously at the pressure of his head, whereupon he turned and caught it with trembling fingers and set it back in place. He lit Daisy's cigarette from a trembling match, and sat down with her on a couch far across the room where there was no light save what the gleaming floor bounced in from the hall. If we're going to town, let's start. His hand, trembling with his effort at self-control, bore to his lips the last of his glass of ale. There, Jay, she said, but her hand as she tried to light a cigarette was trembling. But he wouldn't eat, and the glass of milk spilled from his trembling hand. Jimmy sent me this picture. He took out his wallet with trembling fingers. Almost any exhibition of complete self-sufficiency draws a stunned tribute from me. It is an old timetable now, disintegrating at its folds, and headed this schedule in effect July 5, 1922. But I can still read the gray names, and they will give you a better impression than my generalities of those who accepted Gatsby's hospitality and paid him the subtle tribute of knowing nothing whatever about him. It appreciated fully the chain of national circumstances which had elicited this tribute from Montenegro's warm little heart. She didn't have a good time. He was silent, and I guessed at his unutterable depression. He knew that when he kissed this girl, and forever wed his unutterable visions to her perishable breath, his mind would never romp again like the mind of God. He ran over Myrtle like you'd run over a dog and never even stopped his car. There was nothing I could say, except the one unutterable fact that it wasn't true. He's singing away, her voice saying, "It's romantic, isn't it, Tom?" "Very romantic," he said, and then miserably to me, "If it's light enough after dinner, I want to take you down to the stables." The telephone rang inside, startlingly, and as Daisy shook her head decisively at Tom, the subject of the stables, in fact all subjects, vanished into air. When I looked once more for Gatsby, he had vanished, and I was alone again in the unquiet darkness. Possibly it had occurred to him that the colossal significance of that light had now vanished forever. She vanished into her rich house, into her rich, full life, leaving Gatsby nothing. "Will you just, what was your name?" She vanished. Its vanished trees, the trees that had made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. We went upstairs, through period bedrooms swathed in rose and lavender silk and vivid with new flowers, through dressing rooms and pool rooms, and bathrooms with sunken baths, intruding into one chamber where a disheveled man in pajamas was doing liver exercises on the floor. Each night, he added to the pattern of his fancies until drowsiness closed down upon some vivid scene with an oblivious embrace. Gatsby sprang to his feet, vivid with excitement. One of my most vivid memories is of coming back west from prep school and later from college at Christmas time. On weekends his Rolls-Royce became an omnibus, bearing parties to and from the city, between 9 in the morning and long past midnight, while his station wagon scampered like a brisk yellow bug to meet all trains. A week after I left Santa Barbara, Tom ran into a wagon on the Ventura Road one night and ripped a front wheel off his car. About 5 o'clock our procession of 3 cars reached the cemetery and stopped in a thick drizzle beside the gate, first a motor hearse, horribly black and wet, then Mr. Gatz and the minister and I in the limousine, and, a little later, 4 or 5 servants and the postman from West Egg in Gatsby's station wagon, all wet to the skin. "Highballs?" asked the head waiter. When it was almost morning, the waiter came up to him with a funny look and says somebody wants to speak to him outside. Wolfsheim's nose flashed at me indignantly. He turned around in the door and says, "Don't let that waiter take away my coffee." Then he went out on the sidewalk and they shot him 3 times in his full belly and drove away. 4 of them were electrocuted, I said, remembering. As the waiter brought my change, I caught sight of Tom Buchanan across the crowded room. A waiter knocked and came in with crushed mint and ice, but the silence was unbroken by his "thank you" and the soft closing of the door. Her gray sun-strained eyes looked back at me with polite reciprocal curiosity out of a wan, charming discontented face. "And what does he do?" "Now you're started on the subject," she answered with a wan smile. Her wan, scornful mouth smiled, and so I drew her up again, closer, this time to my face. As we passed over the dark bridge, her wan face fell lazily against my coat's shoulder, and the formidable stroke of 30 died away with the reassuring pressure of her hand. Meanwhile, Tom brought out a bottle of whiskey from a locked bureau door. When I came back, they had disappeared, so I sat down discreetly in the living room and read a chapter of Simon Called Peter. Either it was terrible stuff or the whiskey distorted things, because it didn't make any sense to me. "I'll get some whiskey," answered Tom. "You make it 10 times worse by crabbing about it." He unrolled the bottle of whiskey from the towel and put it on the table. "Open the whiskey, Tom," she ordered. After a moment, Tom got up and began wrapping the unopened bottle of whiskey in the towel. The interior was unprosperous and bare. The only car visible was the dust-covered wreck of a Ford which crouched in a dim corner. A man in a long duster had dismounted from the wreck and now stood in the middle of the road, looking from the car to the tire and from the tire to the observers in a pleasant, puzzled way. Then, very gradually, part by part, a pale dangling individual stepped out of the wreck, pawing tentatively at the ground with a large uncertain dancing shoe.